Today I'm joined by Alicia Miller. Alicia is a co-founder of the Forum on Tax Administration's Community of Interest on Behavioral Insights and has authored several publications on behavioral insights, including her most recent release, Behavioral Insights for Better Tax Administration, a Brief Guide. In her day job, Alicia is the Director of Analytics, Research, and Technology at the IRS. She is passionate about helping organizations build better people strategies and innovation agendas. Alicia, it's nice to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. And I will start off saying I work with the IRS, but today I'm here representing my own views and opinions, and I'm excited to continue the podcast with you all.
Much of your work in recent years has focused on this topic of behavioral insights. What is behavioral insights?
It's about understanding human behavior and applying that to policies, interventions. How can we better achieve our goals? So in tax administrations, whether we're trying to improve our taxpayer services, if we're trying to increase the amount of people that are using some of our tools and services, or if we're trying to improve compliance, all of these are so fundamentally based in behaviors, human behaviors. The more that we can understand that, we can understand why some of our programs are not achieving its objectives, why some of them are, and how we can improve. And so it's all about human behavior.
So you co-founded and led an international tax community on behavioral insights. Can you tell us a bit more about this and how it got started?
Interesting story. One of my colleagues, John, had actually presented at the OECD, started having a conversation with a couple of people, which we carried on. So we actually got a handful of countries together who are doing some work in behavioral insights. This is within tax administration. And we realized we were kind of copying each other. We were borrowing insights and said, hey, what would happen if we talked more regularly, if we shared more about what we're doing, not just some of the more publicized work, but if we really just talked and shared some of the things that are working for us, not working for us, some of our new innovations. And maybe what if we extended this conversation to even more countries? What would happen? And it was so amazing because that's exactly what we did. We started this community of interest. It quickly grew to, more than 30 countries and tax administrations joined the conversation. And it was just amazing to see how much interest and engagement there was on this topic and across the spectrum. Some people had just started out and they're doing their first experiments. Some of these, people like the UK had been around doing this for years. And then we had some that said, okay, well, I don't really know what this is, but it sounds interesting. Maybe I should be in part of the conversation. And they joined us just to learn what it was about. And so, from there, it's just expanded into some really great conversations.
So can you tell us any new ideas that came out of this? Is there an example that you found particularly interesting?
I'll even actually take a step back and say, working in a global level, I think we learned that we all have a lot of similarities in our mission and what we're trying to do, but sometimes there's differences in how we go about it. And so that baseline, not just from behavioral insights, but was interesting from a global perspective. So for instance, I'm from the US. And for years, we would go to taxpayers and say, we will not call you. If you get called, someone's asking you for money, it's a scam. We will not call you. We're very paper-based in our communications, but then talking to some of our colleagues abroad, they actually do have very active call centers. And it was interesting that, in one situation, a taxpayer actually commented, if it's important enough, my tax administration will call me. They will call me and tell me I need to do something. And so it's interesting to look at what some of those differences are, because that does impact some of the strategies. For behavioral insights, a lot of times what we see from behavioral scientists is they're trying to determine what changes behavior and then explain why. What's the reason that you saw these differences between a before and after? And it's usually done through an experimental trial. And so for us, and we might, especially if it's very paper-based, send out a letter communication. We would try different templates and see what worked the best as far as maybe getting people to use some of our help services, or maybe if you have an overdue tax notice to actually make your payments. But one thing that did come out that was interesting is our colleagues in Norway. So a couple of years ago, we all went through a pandemic, completely changed how we work. And so we're sitting here thinking about how we use behavioral insights for building evidence to make better decisions in the future, better operations in the future. And we were walking into an environment where there was no playbook. None of us had ever walked into that environment before, but it was humbling that some of our, you would see some senior leaders saying, what can we do? How can we apply behavioral insights? And they needed something now. And so we would actually canvas and say, what do we know from our literature? What do we think? What are some of our hypotheses about what's going to work? And Tax Norway says, you know what? We're going to send out a survey experiment where they crafted the survey, got a statistical sample, and they would provide information and just say, all right, here's a scenario. Let's say we go out with this communication, and then garner responses about how does this change your perception? And so they actually had a test where they could show that just by advertising that they were going to, this is a test, by the way, they didn't say this to their public, but they said, just as a test, we're going to, reduce the number of audits, which is reasonable. If you have a lot of people working from home, you're limiting contact, people have fewer, people are losing their jobs. It's a reasonable response that you want to show empathy. And I think that was a large part of the conversation. But what they found was there was an increase in the number of people who felt like they didn't trust the organization because more people were going to cheat. And now you're not able to do your job. And so it actually lowered trust in tax administration, according to the experiment. And so to be able to show a new kind of technique to get those insights and bring that back to not only their leadership, but our broader community, and saying, hey, this is something that you might want to be aware of. It's based in the literature. We've been able to show it through this experiment. It was just great to see, again, tax administration applying some innovative techniques, but then also through these dialogues, being able to share that more broadly.
So let's talk about your publication, Behavioral Insights for Better Tax Administration, a brief guide. Can you tell us more about this, please?
Yeah, so this actually came out of our work with the OECD's Forum on Tax Administration. And as we were having this dialogue, as we were talking across the board, we said, this is working. We're getting new insights from people, but how can we take this further? And some of the lessons that we learned are, you kind of need to work at a couple different levels. And for the tax administrations that started down this journey, who were able to have some of their successful applications of behavioral insights, is that, it always started with support from the top levels. When the top levels said, I care about this, I want to see this happen, it was much easier to make things happen. And I think everyone here can relate to that. And so we knew that in order to help some of those, emerging countries and behavioral insights units, that we needed to make sure that they had the awareness at their top level for what to do. And this is one of those areas where we said, okay, we're going to pull together to understand how different people are applying this. We're going to put this together as a vision for what tax administrations can do, what's going to be the value add, how you can get started, but be able to communicate it in a way that's going to reach the top level. And so a lot of our dialogues at the, for instance, if we're working at the practitioner level, we're really getting into those details about how you do different experiments, but these kind of details, but you really needed to take it up a level. And so this was a way for us to really synthesize a lot of our conversations, put together some new ideas that we hadn't been able to put forward, and take it to our top levels and saying, hey, you're going to hear this term behavioral insights. Here's what it is. Here's why you need to pay attention.
You identify several areas of application to tax administration, including taxpayer services as well as enforcement. So what are some of the key takeaways for our audience?
It's great, because one of the things we really wanted to hit on, and I think you'll hear it from another podcast with Ronnie, is this idea of a value chain. And when we talk about human behaviors, it really does take so many different application areas and say there's potential here. And so, one of the areas where we might start is at the end and say, okay, someone hasn't paid their taxes. What can we do to get them to pay their taxes? But then you can look at the entire system and say, but what caused the debt to begin with? Is there something that we can do earlier to prevent that from even happening? And so you can see that there are applications really along the spectrum. When we come to taxpayer services, that's an area where we had a lot of conversation. You'll definitely see a lot there, and anything from a low cost, sending out a letter and applying some behavioral techniques to those letters, all the way to how you design your systems, really shows potential for behavioral insights. And so if we look at taxpayer services, for instance, there are times where, you're having not only those letters to prompt action, but you might also say there's phone calls. Just in how I communicate with you, it might mean you're going to have it, I'm going to do something or I'm not going to do something. And so looking at how do we communicate, does that change when we communicate? Does that change some of these responses? If at the end of the day you're asking me to pay and I just don't have the money in the bank, I'm not going to be able to do that. It doesn't matter like how persuasive you are, we're not going to be able to make that payment. So you have to start with those barriers. But sometimes that barrier is I forgot, I didn't know how. And if we can actually craft the way we interact with our taxpayers to overcome some of those things, it really helps. And so, for instance, if I look at communications, and again, we're looking at the, how, what, where, all lots of different things can matter in how we do communications. But for instance, sending out, going down and identifying who might be impacted, such as, one example is if there is going to be a delay in having refunds delivered. That might result in a lot of phone calls because everyone wants their money. You're going to get a lot of phone calls. If your call centers are overwhelmed and you're thinking, how do I get fewer people to call so I can reduce my hold times? I can make sure I'm providing quality service. Well, if you can identify what are some of those things, like, okay, there's a small set of people that might have some delays for a very particular reason. If you reach out to them and say, hey, here are, we're going to let you know up front that this is going to be delayed. Here's a new time frame which you might be able to expect your refund. Please bear with us. Here's what's going on. If you don't hear, call back in 2 weeks. That might delay several phone calls in the interim. And so being able to segment down to your population, understanding what strategy you want to achieve and how best to do there, that's one example. And so with the services, there's so many different ways that you can approach that. You also mentioned enforcement, and I think that's where tax administration started, right? We came in thinking, if we look historically, like people are rational creatures, they're just trying to not pay. They're going to find any way possible to not pay their taxes. And yeah, I mean, those companies, those people, they do exist. There are people who are getting very creative or simply just being defiant and they don't want to pay their taxes. But other times, it's not always the case. Sometimes it's very innocent of, gosh, you just have a complicated system. I just didn't know that I couldn't claim that deduction. I didn't know that I was supposed to file this form. And so when we understand the complexity around compliance, we can think about how does this work for our strategies, but also knowing that we can't audit everyone. And honestly, I don't think we want to audit everyone. Like, how would our taxpayers feel if every year they had to go through an intensive audit? I mean, at some point, you're not going to have the good feelings towards your tax administration if that's how we're interacting. But one thing that I did find very interesting coming out of behavioral economics is this idea of networks. And so that's something that I find very interesting when we look at enforcement is people talk. We know that, right? You find something that's interesting, you're telling your friend, you're telling your neighbor, you're calling your mom, but people talk. And so that does create a degree of norm. And so what we started hypothesizing and seeing and actually being able to see in the data is that we call these spillovers, where if you have an area of non-compliance, if someone is able to cheat the system, they might tell their friend about this strategy, and then their friend starts doing it, and their next friend starts doing it. And then we say, well, what if we do that with compliance? What if you could actually do an intervention where you try to say, hey, we're watching you. We see that you've missed some payments. Here's some risks here. See what happens. And we started to see with some of our interventions that you actually did find that people started to come into compliance, but there were spillover effects. Sometimes if you're working through a tax preparer and you are auditing one client of that tax preparer, they start realizing that the IRS, the tax administration, is paying attention. So they might talk to their other clients. Hey, the IRS is out there looking at this. And so we actually started to see that other connected individuals also started to change their behavior to, make like increase their payments, come more into compliance. So how can we take that and leverage that? How can we leverage this idea of bringing more transparency towards the enforcement actions where people see that there's a greater risk of detection? These are some of the things that we're learning through behavioral insights. It's not always about what is your actual risk of an audit. Sometimes it's that perception. And if my neighbor, if he gets audited and I see that, oh my gosh, they're in my neighborhood, maybe that's going to affect me. And so when we started seeing these network effects, are there opportunities there for targeting different networks, not doing 100%, but is there a way where we can, penetrate a network of non-compliance where with a small number of actions, we can still reach that entire network? Let's see where the future goes. But I think there's some promise there. And so it's interesting to look at what are those impacts for our communications on enforcement and compliance behavior? What are those impacts of just being able to measure where I haven't knocked on your door, but you're still becoming more compliant. And so I think there's some really exciting things that are going on in the research right now.
The power of good old word of mouth.
Right?
So in the guide, you also talk about digitalization as an accelerator for behavioral insights. What role does digitalization play in this?
Digitalization. And so we mentioned up front, for instance, that some of the easy ways to start this is just changing the design of some of your letters. And when you do that, though, for us in determining the evidence about did this have an impact, we do have to have a degree of randomization. There has to be a degree of there's a group that received this, there's a group that didn't receive this, and that looked basically exactly like the other group. Because if these two groups are basically identical, then if there's a change in behavior across that whole, we can say pretty comfortably we feel that it was due to this change or this letter. So we know that this had an impact. And that's really one of the core things that we're trying to do is build that evidence base so we can make better decisions. So if you have the digitalization where you're collecting, you have the taxpayer group, sometimes that helps in the research, just in the sense of you have the data in the system, you're collecting that data, you can very easily say, all right, here's my groups that I'm going to try this out to, but you also have the data collected. And so as researchers, we're not trying to create that new data, which we can, but it's there in the system. So there's a degree there that helps. But what's really interesting about the digitalization aspect is really going into what we call maybe some choice architecture. There are so many different things that we can do in an online environment. So for instance, if you have a tax administration where you have an electronic filing system where your taxpayers can go in, they're filing this with you. There are opportunities where you can create prompts in the system. And that's another way where you can change behavior, because we always want to get to people at the time that they need to take an action. It's the easiest one, right? Don't tell me today what I need to do 6 months from now. I'm going to forget. It's not going to happen. But how can you reach people in the moment? These systems allow us to do that. So you might see, for instance, even in Australia, they have an example where if a taxpayer is going in, they're filing their taxes. If you're self-employed, you're putting in your expenses, which can lower some of your taxes. If you put in a number that is outside the range of other people in similar situations as you might get a prompt that says, hey, take a look at that. And there's examples like this across the board where, sometimes people, they just, you're moving quickly, there's typos. It's not necessarily that you're trying to cheat the system, but we're moving fast. But these can help bring your attention to things that you can look at. We also have examples where even in call centers, which I found fascinating, people are saying, all right, someone calls in, but how many times do your taxpayers call in? And they really have 3 or 4 things that they need to address, but they just received a letter that says they need to take one action. And so they're calling you for this one specific thing, but maybe there's other issues. And so if you have a person in your call center working with this person, and suddenly a prompt comes up where in the background, there's some kind of AI and technology of just saying, by the way, here's some other things that we see as follow-ups in the system or other gaps. Maybe we're missing some information. Maybe we need to validate something. You're already talking to that customer. You can go ahead and have that holistic service of, let's go ahead and get all of your needs met now. One stop, one shop. Let's just help you as much as we can. And so that's another way where with technology, we can increasingly help people in the moment. But then after the fact, as we started kind of at the beginning, is like understanding who's the population, being able to digitally, through our electronic means, evaluate the impact of things that we're doing. We can also use data in the system. So the more digitalization you have for researchers, for data scientists, people that are looking at data, it gives them more at their fingertips to say, what can I use to help? And being able to look at that where we can segment and say, what are different groups? What are those behaviors of different groups? So that we can really look at what can we do today, but also look at it over time. And I think that's something that we're really interested in from behavioral insight is also what leads to overall long-term compliance. Because if you do something today which increases compliance, but then you find the next year and the year after that and the year after that, people decrease their compliance. Did you have that overall positive impact that you were looking for? So if we started looking at the overall compliance impact of 3 years, what does that look like? Are we changing long-term behavior, or are we just changing one time? Sometimes our interventions around just take an action now, it's short-term. It's going to change their behavior now, hopefully. Make this payment. It doesn't mean they're going to continue making timely payments. You've just gotten them to make this payment. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how can we really evaluate the impact of things long-term? And also, if we're not going to touch everyone, how can we identify those patterns in portions of the population so that we know we're reaching the right people at the right time? You can't reach everyone, but we can try to reach the right people at the right time. And all of this is really enabled through the digitalization and also just making it easy for people. As we go through digitalization, you're also going to see other tax administrations where they're increasingly trying to automate. I don't know about you, Annette, how long it takes you to file your taxes. I would sit there on my systems and it might take me 30 minutes to fill it out. What about you? How long does this take?
Well, it can be quite cumbersome, especially here in the United States. As you know, it's we don't really have pre-filled tax forms or anything like that, so it can be quite time consuming. I mean, I think I start preparing in February to submit in April.
It takes us a while.
Yeah.
So in other countries, and this is something that I learned, where they automate portions of this. Your income gets reported to the tax administration, but then they use that to basically say, here's what you owe, if anything. And I think it was Estonia that they advertised, you can fill out your tax return there in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. I want that system. How can you do this for me where I either don't have to take action at all or I do it in 3 minutes? Let's get there.
Reducing complexity is certainly something that digitalization can introduce. Wonderful. You also address how tax administrations can build capabilities for doing behavioral insights. So for our listening tax administrations that are interested in getting started, what advice can you offer them?
So this is actually one of the top questions that we would get when we're having these conversations. Said, I really want to do something. How can I do behavioral insights? And the first thing that I usually tell people is, there are so many experts out there. Work with experts. Um, there's a lot of people that are really trained in specific techniques that behavioral scientists use. And so you really are looking at how, especially starting out, how can you partner with them, bring that expertise into your tax administration and your conversations. And so there's many ways that people are doing this, but commonly academics. We actually started with ours working with a lot of universities, and others are doing that as well. And from the university side, for us, we actually have in the IRS our Joint Statistical Research Program, where it allows there's a very structured program for this, but you can submit proposals, you can come in, you go through a clearance process, no one's coming in and just getting access to tax data right off the bat. But there's a process by which we can bring in professors or other students who are going to work with us and bring their knowledge, bring some of the latest innovations to say how can we do something here and how can we get insights. And so we actually, through this program, found it very economical because we had this mutual benefit of let's bring in people who can help us get insights, but then we can provide access to data and environments where you potentially could have a publishable insight. And in academia, that's gold, being able to publish. And so for them, that was actually the compensation, the ability to potentially be able to publish new research. And so we didn't have to formally compensate them, such as through contracts. But there's other, a lot of consultant agencies now out there that also will come in and specialize in behavioral insights. And so being able to actually just partner and bring that expertise in-house is really helpful. And also knowing context. What's going to work in one place may not necessarily work somewhere else. And sometimes what is possible within your tax administration is going to be unique to you. So if you were to start out, identify maybe where you want to explore, bring in the experts who've been doing this so that they can help you do an evaluation. They need to work with your programs. They need to work inside. People can't do this independently. It has to really be a joint partnership where you have internal SMEs who know your programs, know your data, know your people, working with this specialized expertise. You might need to look at your legal considerations. There's going to be data access or just access to your, there's those kind of governance considerations where you need to make sure you have those foundations in place, but those partnerships are really the best place to start. Also, we've talked about networks, right? So getting connected to others, like do some research. If you're inside a tax administration, if you're interested, or maybe even better, you're partnering with some of these specialized experts in this. There's a lot of resources out there to help people get started in behavioral insights. You can go to some of our guides where we've gotten started, but also connect with peers. If there are peer groups and others that are having these conversations, these are great opportunities to learn and get started. But that is really, it's just the magic of bringing the right people together and the right environment and doing that evaluation of what can we try, what's going to be possible.
Sounds like a perfect opportunity for us to pitch to that Connect, right?
Absolutely.
A great platform for tax officials to meet and discuss these sorts of issues, and also I believe that your behavioral insights group also has a group on LinkedIn. Is that correct?
There are behavioral insights groups on LinkedIn. So
Okay.
our FTA group is we kind of keep our conversations amongst the member countries. But there are absolutely, there's behavioral economics, there's behavioral insights, there's several different LinkedIn groups that are active in conversations, and they're going to share their research. They're also commenting on things that they're seeing from some of our leading researchers in the field and experts, as well as things that they're seeing from colleagues. It's a fantastic platform these days when we start getting into the ability to connect socially, globally through modern platforms. It's incredible.
Fantastic. And we look forward to having you on To That Connect, Alicia.
Me too.
Is there anything else tax administrations need to know before they get started leveraging behavioral insights?
I think one thing that especially those of us who've been in the community like to emphasize is that you can't expect big changes every time. So if you're a leader in your organization and you're getting started, you can't go in with the expectation that I am going to suddenly have a 50% reduction in compliance by small changes. Sometimes we can, but we can't go in with that expectation. And with behavioral insights, sometimes these experiments work and sometimes they don't. But the reason that we keep approaching them is like any kind of innovation agenda, you have to try it. Especially if you think even in private sector research and development companies, not everything is going to be your major success, but you learn along the way. And that's what's really important, is having that environment where people can learn, being able to not see failure as failure. If the experiment doesn't produce these great changes, it's what did we learn? What else can we try? Keeping that environment safe for people where we feel like we can just move the needle a little bit and be able to experiment. This is very much for me, I see this as part of our innovation agenda, is how can we try new things and how can we see what works? So that's one of the places where we need to start, is that kind of recognition, is it's not going to be your magic 8-ball that basically says, here's how you're going to solve this major problem. Context. One of the areas that we started was just around social norms. We understand that people are social beings, and we like to keep up with the Joneses is one of our phrases, but we like to not feel like there's outliers. If this is the norm, if this is what most people are doing, we like to fall into that. And so some of the early, behavioral nudges you would see are people saying, okay, by the way, let me just let you know that you're one of these outliers. 90% of your community is paying their taxes on time. Just letting you know. and that doesn't work everywhere and doesn't context. And so because that was one of the early ones, we saw that used quite a bit. Everyone wanted to throw those social norms out there, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And it's very contextual. And so that's the point for, if you're a tax administration, you can't always say this worked over here, let's just apply it. We don't need to test it, just apply it, see what happens. And I think that's something that it's a dialogue that I also see in the field as well with practitioners, because sometimes for the practitioner groups, it's, what does a behavioral scientist do? And sometimes you start with all right, there are over 100 cognitive biases. There's a lot of things that we understand about the limitations of the human brain and some of those shortcuts that we make in decision making. And we see how people are applying it elsewhere, whether we're pre-filling forms or we're doing this or we're doing that. And so sometimes we get into a place where it becomes about applying what we know today. And I want to keep encouraging people to really use the techniques to measure behavior and to not feel confined to just applying what we already know. There's a lot there, but still keeping us in that realm of still analyzing, uncovering new things, pushing forward, understanding context matters. So context is something that I will put out there, and there always can be another reason to measure and to test things, is because there can be unexpected outcomes. This is what's fascinating for me, is like, we have these assumptions, and we have our assumptions that say, if we do this, this will happen. And sometimes we take actions and we think it's going to make the world better, and it actually makes it worse. Like, we would want to know that before we rolled it out across the entire population, right? And so one, just to give you an example of that, one of the so Eric Kirschler was just on yours, and so he had actually done some research with us as well. But one of their very interesting studies was that in looking at taxpayers, they did a set of small self-employed taxpayers, but looking at audits and what is the reaction to an audit. And so through their research, they actually showed, for instance, you had two kind of groups where, you go and you have a group that got audited, but one group was determined to not be fully compliant. And through the audit, we basically determined that they needed to pay more taxes. And then there was the other half where you go and you do the audit and you don't find any wrongdoing. You feel like they've paid their fair share of taxes. Maybe they're even owed a refund. Maybe they paid too much in their taxes last year. And so then you look at, okay, well, we've done our audit, we've increased compliance, but then what happens in year 2, year 3? And what they actually found is that there is a noticeable difference between these two groups. The group that was that did not have any change, or they did not have to pay more taxes, suddenly started to report less income and pay fewer taxes. The other group where there was a change, they continued to report higher incomes and pay more taxes. And so it looked like for that group, there's a change. They learned something and they had that continued compliance. But this other group, it looked like compliance decreased. Why? It's an interesting finding. And so sometimes, we wonder, are we helping people not only learn how to be compliant, but are we helping them learn how not to be compliant? It's an interesting question.
You talked about the success stories and opportunity areas, but you also reminded us that sometimes it doesn't work. So what lessons can you share with us about these times when it doesn't work?
I think the culture is really important, and the lessons from leaders, because sometimes I think from a researcher perspective, from your employee perspective, they can get discouraged because people really like to see when things work. But sometimes we also need to take a step back and say, why did it not work? And sometimes it's because we didn't understand the population. We didn't understand the barrier, right? So for instance, if you, outside of an experiment, if you increase your penalties and they're not actually improving first-time compliance, why? Well, if your taxpayers didn't know how to be compliant, increasing your penalties isn't going to change that. So did you actually identify what was the barrier to compliance? What was the reason for this behavior? If it didn't work, maybe there needs to be more research to understand that population. I also think it's interesting to see how things might change over time. So for instance, even if you go back 5 years ago, I think something that some of you guys might be familiar with is these QR kind of codes, right? These things that look like barcodes that are in squares that you can scan in. And there is definitely some popularity around some QR codes because it was innovative. Let's put these on communications. And sometimes you weren't getting a lot of people actually using them. So they were in a lot of communications, but people who received letters or other communications weren't necessarily scanning and clicking to actually take action with them. But we've now gone through the pandemic. Some of you may have been in cities where restaurants were increasingly saying, how can we reduce contact? And they would put these little QR codes out on their tables. And so if you guys were like me, you had never used these QR codes before, suddenly you're walking into restaurants where you're practicing them, you're using them more often, it starts to become, less intimidating, it becomes more common. So here's an event that completely changes how we do our day-to-day. If you start putting those QR codes in your communications after people start using this more regularly, maybe you're going to see a greater take up. I don't know. I haven't seen, I know that there's been greater use of QR codes during the pandemic. And so afterwards, if any of you guys are using those for your taxpayers, are you seeing that they're getting more use nowadays? things that we might learn. Sometimes recycle back to those failed experiences in the past. Maybe they're going to actually be successful later.
Oh, absolutely. But just as a little anecdote, my mother is still trembling in her boots every time she sees those QR codes.
Oh.
So it must be generational.
I absolutely believe that.
Yeah. Well, Alicia, my goodness, just wonderful. Thank you so much for this excellent conversation. At this point, I think I would love to open up the floor to our, small little audience that we have with us today. I know Dimitri, hopefully not to put you on the spot, but I know Dimitri had a question. If you'd like to ask Alicia, the floor is yours.
I'm a great fan of behavioral economics, and you may know the book by Richard Thaler, which is called Nudge, where he and his co-author give some very convincing examples about how we can address systematic biases in human behavior and to adjust that behavior in the best interest of the people. So have you noticed some systematic biases, behavioral biases, when we are talking about tax administration? And what do you think are particularly effective ways to deal with such biases?
Sure. I think there's a few ways that we can kind of approach this as well. And there's certainly the biases from, sometimes we look at our cognitive biases. There's another question that I'm also seeing from our text chat and our audience questions around gender as well. And I think equity is something that's very, it's an important conversation, not only here at home, but globally. And so if we can start there, I think I can say that I have seen, some of the other research where people are looking at in different contexts where there might be those kinds of biases. And the example that I can think of here at home, which I'm not saying that there was a bias, but just how we can look at this and evaluate whether there is a potential bias or is a potential gap. Because when we look at biases, we're saying that some groups are going to be disproportionately affected. And so, for instance, when we started our pandemic, we knew that there was going to be an economic impact, and it was really important for tax administrations to lessen that impact on the taxpayers. And so we saw a lot of stimulus payments going out to individuals, going out to businesses, families. And the way that we wanted to get things out very quickly in the US was just an automated system of, if you paid your tax returns, we'll give you the stimulus based on the contact information that we had from that and the payment information. But not everyone in the US pays their taxes. Not everyone is required to pay their taxes. There's minimum thresholds. And so if you only take that approach, you are missing that entire population that never filed or didn't file in the past couple of years. And so there was a really quick effort to create new systems so that these non-filers can come and file so that they would be eligible and not that they would be eligible, but they would be able to receive these payments. So there wouldn't be that disproportionate impact. And when you start looking at who doesn't file, it's very likely, particularly on those lower income, that you're going to see some differences to the population that is filing their taxes on a regular basis. And so understanding that sometimes the way that we implement can leave some people aside. And also I saw some other research. I know that you guys have done some in the IMF, there's some research out there on this, but also I saw something published with the OECD as well, and looking at, in certain areas, there's different consumer patterns between women versus others. And so if you were to look at your VAT taxes, they were suggesting that there might be a disproportionate impact because of those consumer behaviors. And so I think that's where we kind of start, is really looking at who is impacted. Who do we expect to be impacted by this policy, by this program, by this activity? And how does that differ from the general population? Are we looking at, a certain group is, 10% of the population, but they're 20% of the impacted group. And being able to go in and really take a lens, not towards what policies do we want to impact, but it's the valuation. It's going in, it's sometimes looking at the data of what is going to be that impact. And I think that lens is really important.
So thanks for this really, really engaging discussion, Alicia. And there's just so many questions, but one in particular I had returning just a few days ago from a visit to one of our partner countries. Something that really interests me is what you think would be the kinds of capacity and tools and infrastructure, so to speak, that tax administrations need to have in place to be able to really be able to track and monitor, understand and interpret, and then respond to taxpayer behaviors in the taxpayer population. I'm really curious to hear this because it's one thing to know that tracking behavioral trends is important, but also this idea that you have to be able to use that information, and have the infrastructure in place to do so. So I'm curious what you think needs to be in place to be able to do that.
It can be a little different too, but absolutely, another example just to get started is on phone calls. So we know for e-filing, for instance, if you're electronic filing, if you are saving, all of those, fields somewhere, then it gives us an ability to look at historically, are there differences in how people's income trajectory has gone, or we can look at differences again on things like expenses across people that have similar occupations. But it starts with collecting that data somewhere. So having that data stored, and there's different ways that people can do it. There's sometimes people are looking at data warehousing. You can move into environments of data lakes. There's different ways in the data, but having your data engineers come in and say, how can we, and your IT departments are really important to say, how can we create that environment to store that, but also how are you collecting it? How are you transmitting that data on call centers? If you had people that called and they're calling multiple times, if you could see in the data that from a particular phone number, they're calling multiple times, you immediately know this person is not having their need met. There's an issue there. So if you were able to follow up and say, we saw that you had to call multiple times, or if you had survey data where, someone called in and then there's a survey that says, was your need met? There's technologies now where we can do voice to text, where you're just having a phone conversation with your call center, transcribing that. And I think we see that also, like, this call may be recorded for training purposes. If you were to transcribe that and store that data somewhere, it takes sometimes, that can take up a huge infrastructure. There's a lot of, you might have larger payments to actually store the amount of data, but there's options for whether you're doing it like on-prem, which is on your local infrastructure, or if you're going into a cloud. I mean, there's different ways that you can do that. Most important is having that infrastructure available. And sometimes it's just massive. It's too much. It's too much data. I mean, if we think about the amount of taxpayers that we have, even in America, that's a lot. And it also, your systems and trying to search that data can be very slow. So not only is it important to have that data, but sometimes how can you condense that data to make it easier for people to actually work through that? And so sometimes pilots of, let's just get a small subset to work with and see how can we better work with this information. Or if, for instance, maybe you don't need all of the data that's collected, but sometimes what we would do in a research environment is, we might make a copy, you get select fields and you put it in a smaller environment. I hear, at least in the technology space, the conversation's gone from big data to small data. It's how can you pull out just what you need and put it into a smaller environment when you're going and running these computer codes to grab this data. It can do this more quickly. So that you can really enable your researchers and your teams to work with this better. And so I might defer that question to some of our IT, but I think it's interesting to know and recognize that even for research, sometimes we are creating separate research databases so that we're not necessarily pinging their systems. There's a bit of a security there of saying, here's kind of a separate data set. And also sometimes if we're looking at just overall events and the impact, we might even de-identify that data. So that's another consideration that tax administrations might have in some areas where you can go in and remove all of the identifiers or give it some random identifiers so that you actually don't know which taxpayer that is. You're helping to protect that data, but still being able to see what are those aggregate insights. That doesn't always work if you're trying to identify, like, Joe has called me 20 times and he really needs some help, guys. We really need to talk to Joe. So that's one thing that I think on the infrastructure is just working with your IT, your data engineers to say, how can we build this, but also working with analytics teams, depending on the size of your data sets, your big data, the analysts also know there's various different tools out there that people can use. And it's depending on your size of the data sets. I frequently see in our behavioral economists, they have certain tools that they use, but we have R or SAS or Python, which a lot of people are using in kind of this big data kind of environment. So that's one area where if you're looking at more of the data analytics side and using that for behavioral segmentation and behavioral analytics, those are some of those tools there. But I don't want to limit that because, as we were mentioning earlier with this survey experiment from Tax Norway, there are different tools that they would use for those kind of survey experiments. Other people are taking people in the lab. If you don't have this data infrastructure, you can still start today. One thing to note is that just because people say they're going to behave a certain way doesn't mean they will behave a certain way, which is why we really like to put these out in the field and see how people actually behave. But there are times where people can bring people in a lab and do an experiment where, you see this. How does this make you feel? What is your perception of the tax administration? What actions do you think you need to take? What actions would you take? There's different ways where you can take this, but I do think being able to look at the data in a real environment is going to give you a lot more meaningful data. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's helpful, but I think also we mentioned kind of the calls and being able to transcribe that to text, because there's definitely a lot of other techniques now where people can go in and glean insights from that data. And again, if you see someone's calling 10 times and you have that transcript and you can say, what are those key terms that they're calling about? And you see that there's 20 people that are calling 10 times and those same key terms are coming up in those conversations. That's an area where you can say, what? Maybe that's an area where we need to go in and actually change our procedures. We can change our procedures to how we're interacting so that people aren't calling us 10 times, that they can actually get addressed. Maybe there's different routing of some of those calls, a different prompt that you put to help them get to the right person. And other times, maybe there's something that you can identify in advance. Maybe you identify some people are calling because they need to update their bank account information for their refund. And you can see in the system if people are missing some of those, and you now have an online way to do that. It doesn't guarantee they're going to go online, but you can send those people a communication that says, hey, by the way, we recognize that you have not updated your bank account information. In order to give you a process your refund timely, we wanted to provide this opportunity for you to do it. Here's an easy way of clicking this link and go in and making that happen. That's something that might work for your tax administration. And sometimes those behavioral designs and applications, it can start with the data, but other times, just looking at how our systems are designed, we can do that without some of the infrastructure as well.
I just wanted to find out from your experience where you have been able to implement this in any of the tax administrations, what has been the experience, especially for those tax administrations that are just on a journey of data-driven compliance management? Especially that it's when you come down to Africa, we are adopting technology. And yes, the technology is there, so there's a lot of data, but bringing your staff on board to be able to use this data to make decisions regarding the taxpayer and revenue management.
Yeah, oh, that's so exciting also to see you guys starting your journey. On the implementation, I think we've seen some really successful implementations, and sometimes when they have been successful, it's kind of like, if we've done some of our experiments, part of it is getting the right stakeholders together, is getting that right buy-in. And then on the system design side, where I can definitely see in some of our other colleagues internationally, where they're designing more of the online systems of interacting with the tax administration. They've actually had some really good successes, and I've seen some results, for instance, even in Australia, where putting in these prompts, they saw a lot of changes in the data just by having these prompts. There's also an example over in New Mexico where they're looking at unemployment insurance and doing very similar things of helping to make sure that when people are going to file and claim some of these benefits, that they are actually eligible, and using some prompts to make sure that you're that the people are admitting to some of the income that might make them not eligible for some of these benefits. And so there have been some really successful implementations, both in maybe some letter experiments, changing some of the call scripts, as well as just designing some of your online systems that's going to encourage some of the results. And we do have a few examples that are going to be in the Behavioral Insights for Better Tax Administration, a brief guide as well.
Alicia, we cannot thank you enough. You and Ronnie have been just instrumental behind the entire BI series we've been producing in the podcast. It's thanks to you that we've had Eric on, and Anders, and this is wonderful, and we look forward to having you back again, hopefully sometime in September, with everyone all together, so we can revisit some of these topics. Just wonderful. Maybe I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I don't know, Justin, Mambo, if you wanted to ask a question quickly, or.
No, just wonderful. This is wonderful. This is wonderful to see. I mean, these are things that we seem to know day to day, but coming at it from a realistic and pragmatic perspective is really wonderful. Alicia, thank you very, very much. And also to appreciate Dimitri, Blenda, Steve for the questions. It lends a lot to what we are all trying to do. Networking, ecosystems, and so on. And it leads me back to what is going on in Nairobi, which Dimitri knows about. And Steve has just been back from Uganda, where Blenda is one of the critical communications persons. And Dimitri also lives in Uganda. So Steve, you missed each other. But it's that networking. People want to know what is happening elsewhere so that they shortcut the implementation processes and the whole experience, and not repeating the same, going into that problem trap, and those challenges. They learn, and it's just wonderful, Alicia. Thank you very, very much. I'm so excited. Especially linking your community of BIs to that connect. That's incredible.
I'm really excited to connect further.
And Alicia, we invite you to leverage our platform for surveys or any kind of research perhaps that you're involved in.
Also, I think blended to yours, when you're talking about kind of the data-driven journey, let me throw in a couple additional insights as well. One of the things that I think when we're getting started, it's not just about the implementation, but it's getting the organization ready for doing things differently. And these are conversations where I will say starting with the top level, having that top level buy-in, going back to that is really, really important. The next is buy-in at even lower levels of sometimes starting with those examples and business cases of here's where it's been done elsewhere, showing that it has had some successes as you were asking, I think does help people along their journey of kind of overcoming some of their apprehension where, okay, so I have seen that somewhere else, someone's done that successfully, maybe that can be successful here. And also recognizing, if you are implementing any kind of innovation, any kind of data driven, there are changes even to our employees about how they approach things, how they use things. And so if you're asking people to use data, do they have the skills to use data? Do they feel comfortable? Do you have that data literacy where it's building that capacity within your organization? And sometimes it's building habits, because there's very certain ways that we like to do things, and we do those repetitively, we do those over and over again. And so then when you throw something at us that says, how, do it differently, use this information, some people are going to catch on very quickly, and other people are going to be slower, and recognizing where your people are in the adoption of those new processes, those new tools. And sometimes it's a complete change. Are there jobs that are going to be impacted? Because whenever we move digitalization, there's usually people that were doing something similar in a very manual fashion. And they, if the organization is going to be moving to a more automated way to do things, for instance, it might mean that these individuals are no longer going to be doing some of those jobs and those same jobs, and maybe they're going to be shifted into other things. And so preparing the organization for data driven, definitely have communications often, like have your leadership express repeatedly their commitment to this, having more feedback loops through the organization that says, how are things going? How do they understand? Do you have the organization bought in and along that journey with you? All of those communications and feedback loops and making sure people know what they need to know is going to be really important as kind of an overarching approach to getting the organization ready for that journey.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Have a lovely week and a lovely summer. And as always, if we can support you in any way, please reach out to us.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.